the society as a whole, we have moved away. And when you're sending your kids out through K-12 education, you're sending them into a tough place when you're putting them there. Now, I've watched numerous times as I was growing up, and I would go to Sunday school, and we participated in Awana, and I would see great kids that were around me, but as I watched their lives, and as I look back now and having seen where they've went, so many different paths, but only a few that really stayed on the straight and narrow.
What happened with Josh Duggar and what is now happening with Joseph Duggar did not occur in a vacuum, and did not begin with either of them. And understanding the full scope of what has been uncovered requires going back much further than either of their arrests, and looking honestly at the environment that shaped them, the people who surrounded them, the systems that failed them, and the children they harmed, and the patterns that have been repeating in this community for decades without genuine accountability or intervention. A new name has emerged in connection with the Duggar family circle: Jonathan Hodnet, a 43-year-old man who is currently incarcerated in the Arkansas Department of Corrections, after being sentenced in 2025 on charges of computer crimes and internet stalking of a minor under 15, sentenced to 8 years with 10 years of suspended sentence upon release. And the reason his name matters in the context of the Duggar story is that Jonathan Hodnet was not a stranger to this family. He was someone Jim Bob Duggar brought into his life when Jonathan was a child, a young man without a father whose family became deeply entangled with the Duggar household during the 1990s. And the details of his charges are deeply troubling because they involve using social media to contact a minor under 15, attempting to solicit illegal contact, offering to pay between $200 and $300 for that contact, and requesting illegal images, all Class B felonies under Arkansas law, and all disturbingly consistent with the pattern of behavior that has now touched multiple men who grew up in and around the Duggar family circle. The charges against Jonathan Hodnet emerged from a Facebook investigation. He found this child on Facebook, communicated with her over several days in July of 2023, attempted to arrange a meeting, got cold feet at the last minute, but had already solicited illegal images, and law enforcement was able to identify him through his phone number. And what makes this connection to the Duggar story so significant is not just the nature of the charges, but the fact that Derick Dillard, who is married to JL Duggar, remains Facebook friends with Jonathan Hodnet, confirming that this is not a peripheral connection, but someone the Duggar world actively maintained a relationship with into the present day. Now, to understand how Jonathan Hodnet came into the Duggar family's orbit requires understanding a practice that Jim Bob Duggar engaged in for years that was framed within the IBLP belief system as ministry and mentorship, but that in practice meant bringing fatherless children and their mothers into his sphere of influence. Because a core teaching of the IBLP world is that every fatherless child deserves a father figure, and this teaching was used to encourage men like Jim Bob to seek out single mothers and widows and bring their children under their wing, and the stated purpose was spiritual mentorship, but the practical effect was bringing vulnerable families who lacked resources and support into a closed system, where Jim Bob controlled information, controlled access, and controlled the narrative about what was appropriate and what was not. The Hodnet family is one example of this pattern. Kim Hodnet was a widow with 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, and at various points in their lives, members of that family either lived with the Duggars or worked for them, with Kim's daughter serving as a mother's helper to Michelle in an arrangement that was less about genuine opportunity and more about providing free labor to a family that already had enough children to run a household. And Jonathan and some of his brothers came into close contact with Josh Duggar during this period, growing up alongside him in the same homeschooling community, attending the same church gatherings, and being shaped by the same closed environment that was presenting itself to the outside world as a model of wholesome Christian family life. The Alert Academy, the IBLP's program for young men that was presented as a character-building and reform program, is deeply woven into this story because Jonathan Hodnet's stepfather ran or was significantly involved in the Alert Academy, and multiple young men from this community, including some from the Duggar circle, were sent through the Alert Academy as a response to behavioral problems rather than receiving actual clinical therapeutic intervention. And the evidence is now now overwhelming, that the Alert Academy did not rehabilitate anyone, did not address the underlying trauma and behavioral issues that these young men were exhibiting, and in some cases made things worse, by further immersing already troubled young people in a closed ideological system that framed their problems as spiritual failures rather than as clinical issues requiring professional treatment. Now the story goes even further back than Jim Bob's recruitment of fatherless families and further back than the Alert Academy, because sources have shared information about the role that JL Duggar, Jim Bob's father, and Josh's grandfather, played in the environment that shaped Josh from a very young age. And this is deeply disturbing information that Amy Duggar has written about in her own book, describing a grandfather who was known within the family to be predatory, who cheated on his wife Mary, who was found to have deeply inappropriate and explicit material at his car lot, and who, according to Amy's account, attempted to assault her, and who she was never allowed to be alone with. Amy writes about being locked in rooms specifically to keep her grandfather away from her at night. Josh Duggar spent time working at his grandfather's car lot as a young child, alone with JL, exposed to the material that JL kept there, and sources who know this family have said that Josh's behavior began to change after that period of time spent alone with his grandfather, that he began exhibiting hyperfixated, inappropriate behaviors that were beyond what would be considered normal childhood curiosity, and that these behaviors began before Josh had even reached puberty, which is consistent with what clinical experts understand about children who have themselves been victimized, and who then act out what they have experienced on other children. What makes this even more significant and more troubling is that sources allege that Josh's acting out in the Duggar home was not limited to his sisters, that it also involved his brothers and other children who were part of the Duggar family's social circle during those early years, and that some of these incidents involved children who were very young, some toddler-aged, and that the adults in the household became aware of what was happening and responded not by getting Josh clinical help or reporting to authorities but by creating household rules, designed to prevent opportunities, rules that acknowledged something was wrong without ever addressing what was wrong or getting any of the affected children genuine help. Forgiving well, some of the right passes from opportunities, rules that acknowledged something was wrong without ever addressing what was wrong or getting any of the affected children genuine help. Forgiving well, the rules that Michelle Duggar is known to have implemented around children playing together and closed doors are not random parenting choices. They are the legacy of a period in the early Duggar household when adults knew that something seriously wrong was happening among the children and chose management over accountability, and the children who were affected by what Josh was doing during that period, both his sisters and, according to sources, his brothers and some of the children from families like the Hodnets who were brought into the Duggar orbit, never received proper therapeutic support, never got to tell their stories in a safe environment with a qualified professional, and were raised within a system that told them what happened was a stumbling block that had been addressed through prayer and church discipline, rather than a trauma that required professional healing. The pattern that emerges when you trace all of these connections is not random or coincidental. It is the product of a specific environment, a specific belief system, and specific choices made by specific adults over multiple decades. And the three young men who were part of this cohort of homeschooling children in the 1990s, Josh Duggar, Joseph Duggar, and Jonathan Hodnet, have all ended up incarcerated as adults for crimes against children, and that is not a coincidence. That is a pattern, and patterns require investigation, not just of the individuals who committed crimes, but of the environment and the people who created the conditions in which those crimes became possible and even normalized. The question that sources who know this family keep coming back to is the question of Jim Bob Duggar's own role in all of this, not just as a father who failed to get his son help, not just as a patriarch who covered up crimes to protect the family's reputation, but as the person at the center of a network of families and children and young men who kept getting brought into his orbit under the banner of ministry and mentorship. And sources have been consistent in saying that while JL Duggar is universally identified as a significant source of the trauma that shaped Josh's early behavior, questions about Jim Bob's own conduct and his own awareness of what was happening in and around his household have never been fully answered or fully investigated. The IBLP connection runs through every aspect of this story. It was the IBLP framework that justified bringing fatherless children into the Duggar home as a form of ministry. It was the IBLP framework that counseled against reporting to law enforcement and against traditional therapy. It was the IBLP framework that sent troubled young men to the Alert Academy rather than to qualified clinicians. It was the IBLP framework that treated child sexual abuse as a spiritual stumbling block rather than a crime. And it was the IBLP framework and specifically figures like Dodie Murphy who helped position the Duggar family for television and who were instrumental in constructing the public image that allowed all of this to remain hidden for so long. Dodie Murphy, the physician who helped Bill Gothard rewrite medical literature for the IBLP's Medical Institute, who was a key IBLP leader, who was instrumental in getting the Duggars a television show, who was described as instrumental in counseling Jim Bob against traditional therapy for Josh, has since passed away, but allegations that he himself committed acts similar to what his protégés and associates committed have circulated among people who knew him, and those allegations have never been fully investigated or publicly addressed. What is needed now? What has been needed for years but is more urgently needed than ever given everything that has come to light, is a comprehensive top-down investigation into the Duggar family, the IBLP network, the Alert Academy, and the broader community of families that Jim Bob recruited and managed over decades, because there are adults in that community right now who were children in the 1990s and early 2000s, who know what happened, who watched what happened, who experienced what happened, and who are no longer willing to keep those secrets because they have watched the people they grew up with end up in prison. And they understand that silence only allows the cycle to continue. The authorities in Arkansas have the capacity to pursue this investigation, and sources indicate there is active interest in doing so. And the people who need to be interviewed are out there, and some of them are ready to talk. And for anyone who is part of this community as a child, and who experienced harm or witnessed harm, the most important thing to know is that in Arkansas, there is no statute of limitations on many categories of child sexual abuse, meaning it is not too late to report. And even a report that does not result in charges creates a formal record that investigators can use to build a pattern and protect future children. The cycle that produced Josh Duggar and Joseph Duggar and Jonathan Hodnet will not end on its own. It will only end when enough people speak up, when enough records are reviewed, when enough questions are asked by people with the authority to demand answers, and when the adults who chose to manage and conceal rather than report and heal are finally held accountable for the role their choices played in creating the environment that damaged so many children over so many decades.